Ladies and gentlemen, open banking pioneers, thank you very much for joining us today. You're very welcome around our campfire. And we're going to be talking about preparing for PSD3, a landmark for open banking, question mark. Well, is it? Well, we're going to find out. Now, you'll often hear me say, nobody's born knowing about open banking, and we all have a day one. Now, if that was to involve studying European legislation, it would be a tricky Monday morning indeed. So what we've done is we've gathered industry experts around our campfire to make it relevant, to really make it come alive, and to answer that so what question, and what does it really mean for me, and what does it really mean for our businesses? Now, we've got a good amount of time, maybe to 26, to get ready, but it's important, as you're going to hear today, that we start to influence and we start to prepare. Now, today we're going to be talking about the Third Payment Services Directive, PSD3, which is something of a sequel to the game changer PSD2. However, rather than simply replacing PSD2 with PSD3, the European Commission has introduced a wider draft of payment services packages, which sets out new and updated rules, which will positively impact open finance. And this is where it gets really exciting. These rules will bring a much wider range of financial services into the European data sharing ecosystem, and they will include pensions, insurances, and many more. Now, this package consists of two things: a directive, which is PSD3, and regulation, which is the Payment Services Regulation, PSR. So directive, regulation. Now, as I'm sure everybody knows, a directive needs to be transposed into national law once they've passed it by each member state. A regulation is applied to all member states, which means there is no interpretation at a national level. So, in fact, PSD2 becomes PSR1. So the PSD2 that we know and love, and we've talked so comfortably about for years now, will actually become the Payment Services Regulation #1. Yeah, so far so good. It really is quite straightforward when you get under the bonnet, I promise you. Now, there is a really interesting addition, and that's the EU have put forward a proposal for legislation for a financial data access framework, and that's FIDA. And I believe this will be particularly impactful. Now, FIDA will establish clear rights and obligations to manage customer data sharing for the financial services sector. Now, that's beyond payment accounts to credit institutions, payment institutions, investments firms, insurance undertakings. So what does FIDA do? Well, it obliges everybody in the market participants, to both equip customers with dashboards for financial data access and permissions, and devise a common scheme standards for customer data sharing and exchange. So dashboards and that financial access permissions is a key one, but we're going to hear more about that later. It's a framework that is designed to encourage the creation of innovative financial services and to stimulate competition in the financial sector. Now, anybody that's been in open banking for since day one will have heard that before. So this is an environment everybody in this ecosystem should be very, very familiar with playing in, and that's where I think it gets exciting, because this is what we do. So what does it actually mean? Just to summarize, I've got a couple of bullet points here. It means better quality of APIs, and that's going to lead to better banking services, more streamlined auths. Now, that can only mean an improved checkout experience. And we've got people on the panel today that I am genuinely looking forward to hearing from how that is going to, the differences that's going to make. Okay. Direct access to payment systems for FinTechs. Now, that has to be an absolute game changer. Now, you've got IBAN and name matching to prevent fraud. Everybody knows that the benefits of that. Now, in terms of the ecosystem, with the merging of licensing laws, and there's some work we need to do in terms of understanding there. So today, we're going to cut through all of the complexity to educate you about PSD2, I've said PSD2. It's like, we said this before, it's like the change between His Majesty and Her Majesty. What I should have said was, we're going to educate you about PSD3 and PSR1 and FIDA. And to inspire you about the opportunities it's going to create. And what does it mean for you, and what do you need to get ready? So you can see at the right of your screen a Slido question. And I know that people are actually already answering this before the campfire started. So it's what will be the most impactful, PSD3 or the PSR1 or FIDA? And that, I think, is sort of focuses the mind a little. So our aim here now is to educate, inform, and inspire. So please do get involved. Do ask the panel of experts a question. There is no such thing as a daft question. Everybody has a day one. So here we go. Our campfire today is hosted even by Doug McKenzie, who you'll know is the content editor of FS News. Now, he's going to start with a fireside chat with Piers, who is the chief product officer at CurrencyCloud, which is a Visa solution. Doug, come on. I am dying to learn more from you and Piers. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Helen. It's such a pleasure to be around this campfire, because we were kind of talking just before we jumped on how it really does feel like we are at the forefront of the industry. We're at this point where we can still shape and really look at the next couple of years as we are kind of going to shape it. And joining me here around this campfire, this fireside chat, is Piers. Piers, how are you doing? You good?
I'm doing very well, thank you, Doug.
Absolutely.
How are you?
Brilliant. I'm doing absolutely excellent as well. Good. And kind of a word that I think that Helen brought up earlier was the word sequel. And it's so funny that we're already tripping over PSD2 to PSD3. We've been talking about PSD2 for so many years. It's become such a landmark, and I'm really hoping that PSD3 is going to shape up in that same way. But before we get into that, let's kind of understand a bit about you. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and CurrencyCloud, please?
Sure thing. And hopefully the move from PSD2 to 3 is literally just one number change, but let's see how many times we trip ourselves up in this session for the next few minutes. So yeah, just a bit of background about CurrencyCloud. For those of you who haven't heard of CurrencyCloud, we provide an FX, an international or cross-border payments platform that powers some of the leading and most progressive banks and FinTechs and FX brokers around the world, the likes of Revolut and Starling Bank or Standard Bank down in South Africa. And we allow those clients and their end customers to be able to collect, to convert, to hold multi-currency balances in 30 currencies, and also to pay out to about 180 countries and territories around the world every year. Probably more excitingly, at the end of 2021, we were acquired by Visa. And actually just last month at Cybos, we launched Visa Cross-Border Solutions, which is really the coming together of some of Visa's homegrown treasury as a service, cash management and cross-border capabilities with the platform that CurrencyCloud has built over the past few years. So, we provide a variety of different solutions to meet different use cases that all revolve around the FX and international money movement capabilities.
Absolutely incredible.
And yeah, I'm as Helen said, I'm CPO at the CurrencyCloud platform. I've been at CurrencyCloud for about 6 years, Visa for almost 2 years. And before that, spent a fair bit of time in the global maritime tech industry, also in product management. So a complete industry shift.
Yeah, I mean, it's cross-border in a
exactly,
way. So
exactly.
And obviously, jumping into CurrencyCloud at that point 6 years ago, we're talking PSD2 time. So you've been really shaped by, and it must have been such an important part of your career, all our careers. So it's very fascinating to actually see that journey. Piers, thank you so much for being opposite me here in this fireside chat. Now, we've set the scene with you, but now let's set the scene about the industry. And one thing that's so important about understanding PSD3 is to understand PSD2 and its impact. And as we just said, I can't think of someone better that was going to actually be better placed to tell us that impact. So could you briefly describe PSD2? I know that our audience here today are fully aware of it, but I think it's good to underline it. But more importantly, could you then go on to tell, in your view, its impact?
Perfect. Yes, always important to start with the context. So as Helen said, PSD2 stands for the Second Payment Services Directive. And actually, we've, as an industry, been talking about this for a long time. I think the first, it was released in I think 2015, and it came into full effect at the start of 2018. And I suppose that, almost 6 years on now, actually, it gives us that ability to look back with hindsight and think about some of the impact and perhaps project forwards to think about what the impact of PSD3 might be going forward.
Yeah.
Really to boil a lot of words down into maybe 3 or 4 key pillars, PSD2 really was maybe perhaps implemented to attempt to revolutionize probably some of the payments industry. Real emphasis on making electronic transactions money safer, allowing more innovation to kind of occur across the industry, and probably with a real focus on end customer needs. Really, as a product person, really coming back to what are the problems that end consumers or end customers actually have. What are the things that are still causing friction, and then looking for ways in which to solve, to remedy, to improve some of those things. There were probably a few key elements that came out of that. So from the security side, strong customer authentication, SCA was a fairly big milestone actually, from a PSD2 perspective, really looking to improve some of the security on a digital transaction perspective. So we're all now used to that sort of multiple factor authentication that we've invariably got on our mobile phones. I think another key area was from a competitive perspective. I think if we think back, 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, there was a real intention to level that playing field between the traditional banking landscape versus perhaps the more emerging non-bank PSPs.
It was far more kind of, I don't want to use the word combative, but it was definitely, there was a competitive element in the air, wasn't there?
Certainly, I remember distinctly having lots of conversations at conferences and with banks about fintech perhaps being the enemy, which then became
apocalyptic
the frenemy
mode
back in sort of 2017, 2018. Yeah. And that narrative really has moved on to one of cooperation and collaboration over the last few years, which has been amazing to see how some of that collaboration brings to life brand new experiences for customers. I think probably just the last thing to call out from a PSD2 impact perspective is open banking itself, right? There were other initiatives that helped bring this really to life, but PSD2 definitely paved the way for the way open banking has proliferated in the UK, especially, but also in the EU. We were talking about with Helen just now, actually, before this started, about the UK being considered an open banking Mecca. Which is probably true if you think about the variety of new use cases that have emerged, the new ways in which we are solving for real life customer problems using open banking.
And with that in mind, I mean, it's such an exciting ecosystem to be a part of, and it's shown the impact that it's spawned a movement. As you said, I think that was your exact words. It's the open banking. You can call it what you want, see its successes, but to have a directive, have a regulation that has had such a brilliant impact on the whole industry has been so exciting, and I've certainly enjoyed being a part of that wave. But then, we've understood that wave. We've understood the movement. Let's get on the back of the bus and find out what it's going to change with PSD3 and PSR1. Maybe we could understand what that definition is, and that fact that PSD2 is now being enshrined into that regulation. And what is it designed to achieve? I think that's the most important thing. So that in 10 years' time, we'll know if it was a success. If we can state what it was designed to achieve at the beginning and how it differs from what we were previously working towards, I think that'd be a brilliant linchpin. I don't suppose, Piers, would you have that?
Let me attempt it. So I think there are various comments online that you might read about or see or hear about that talk about PSD3 perhaps being an evolution, not a revolution.
Okay.
But actually, when we're thinking about whether this will be a game changer or not, I think we again have to cast our minds back 5, 6, 7, 8 years and think about really the game changing that has happened because of PSD2. So I think, as Helen mentioned at the very start of this, the difference between a directive versus a regulation, between PSD3 versus PSR1, is quite crucial here, right? The regulation doesn't have to be transposed via or into 27 EU member states' different legislations and regulations.
Yeah.
And that will have a positive impact on the way some of the or all of the regulations are then harmonized and adhered to across the entirety of the Eurozone.
Yeah.
But I think if we think about PSD3, I think there are again, if we think about what has happened over the past 5 or 6 years or so, the financial services landscape has dramatically changed with the digital acceleration post-pandemic, with the advent and probably the adoption to a certain extent of maybe crypto assets, with the rise of services like BNPL, the buy now, pay later offering. There are all sorts of new services, types of products that are being adopted and used more and more widely across the industry. And PSD3 really starts to incorporate some of those rapid changes that we've seen over the past few years into what will hopefully be that next wave of open banking, and perhaps moving much more definitively into an open finance world. Again, Helen touched on the importance of FIDA and perhaps the journey that starts to help us on as an industry. Yeah. But I do expect there to be, with PSD3, some of those other services we will start to see with high levels of regulation. We will in turn start to see that level of consumer trust, that confidence in some of those services, which in turn will likely increase some of the adoption of certain of those services across the industry.
Absolutely amazing. And it's funny, you were hitting on similar notes that while you were reconnecting, Helen and I were taking on from what you're saying, and the fact that we're seeing increased product offering that is affecting what the customer is going to be expecting from PSD2 and PSD3, and the customer is getting generally more aware of it because of these new products that we're seeing. You mentioned crypto, but you also then touched on FIDA, and I know we've got to move into the kind of panel session, so I'm only going to ask you for a very brief kind of roundup on this. But as you mentioned, Helen did bring up FIDA, and I think it's going to be such a critical point to this new open finance evolution, apologies. So yeah, could you let us know about it before I bring in the rest of our panelists?
Again, yes, sure. FIDA again stands for the Financial Data Access, and it's a framework launched by the EU Commission. It was only launched or announced as a draft proposal in, I think it was June this year. But I like to think about it as sort of 3 concentric circles on this journey towards open data. PSD2 has really enabled that open banking in that first concentric circle. Yeah. FIDA, perhaps with PSD3, I think will pave the way to that open finance world. If you really extending this out, extending that journey out towards all sorts of other financial products and services. And the data access towards them, which is an absolutely key stepping stone towards that wider journey of open data, incorporating Definitely. Things like retail, healthcare data to give us a better picture of our digital financial lives.
I can't agree more. It really does showcase that. I mean, everyone always talks about data being the new oil, but it really is what powers this evolution. So I'm so excited to see what gaining that access is going to mean for so many really hungry individuals and organizations that want to be part of this wave. Now, let's have the wave crashing down and bring on the rest of our panelists here today. Guys, thank you so much for listening in to that that fireside chat. I hope that's given you some ideas to bring to the table. But we're going to jump in really and kind of take what we've said. We've got that brilliant understanding from Piers and find out what's next for PSD3, and more importantly, how this new European legislation is actually going to enable this new form of open banking, that is open finance. Anu, thank you so much for joining. Could I have your input here? I'm really excited to see what this legislation, how it's going to change to open finance.
Thank you so much, Douglas. So very on par with what Piers just spoke about in terms of PSD3. But if you look at the regulation and what PSR, PSD3 and FIDA collectively are trying to achieve, it's really giving PSD2 that kick and momentum it needs in the market. And the way I look at how they're trying to achieve that objective, it's almost kind of threefold. It pans from how do you impact the individual, how do you impact the wider payments community, and how do you impact the whole European market? So if I start from the last point there, so that the wider framework, it's an overarching framework that pans across the European market, and really tackles some of the fragmentation, the arbitration that we have seen with PSD2, which has been problematic in the framework. And what it tries to achieve is really drive through standardized RTSs, some standards around authorization and registration, an overarching kind of set of rules that guides the whole market. And then if I bring it back to the kind of PSPs and the players in this space, it really drives the point around access to them. So direct and indirect access to all EU payment systems and including bank accounts, card schemes, central banking schemes. And this also kind of stipulates that credit institutions, for example, have to give these PSPs access to bank accounts in the future. So that really takes a quite different angle compared to PSD2, because they are pretty much holding them by the collar, saying, you can't not let these PIs join into this regime anymore. And then finally, and one of my favorite probably topics to talk about is the impact to the consumer, because one of the things that PSD3 really drives is consumer protection and the confidence they feel around transactions and their data. And this is what FIDA tries to take and almost commercialize, monetize, and create that open finance framework around. So a couple of things that they are doing around consumer protection is there's going to be stricter rules around fraud and financial crime. Things like refund rights for consumers are going to be stricter compared to PSD2, and some of the regulations that we have were aligning to the regulations we put in place or we are hoping to put in place in the UK. There's also an element of further education for the consumers around fraud and financial crime. There's going to be changes to SCA, strengthen that, look at how we face two-factor authentication in the future. And then also kind of final point around stronger supervisory for these new players. So how do you safeguard the customer's funds, and do these players have the right wind down plans that gives the customers, the consumers, the confidence they need at the end of the day? So that's in a whole what is next with PSD3, but what does it mean for open finance? Helen touched on this earlier around what is finance, what is open finance? It could be mortgages, loans, it could be savings, it could be pensions, right? So it pans across a plethora of financial products. But what the directive does, and PSR and FIDA tries to do, is really give access and put that access or the onus of that access towards the consumer, so that they, through new dashboards, standardized APIs, can manage and navigate the access that they give to these PSPs, give the ability for these PSPs to read that data and provide better financial products on top of that. So that really creates a new spearhead in terms of where we can take open finance.
I think it's so brilliant to hear that it's just opening this forum for increased innovation by opening up those data channels. But then, as both Helen and yourself have just said, this isn't just payments anymore. This is impacting every vertical. And I'm really excited to think what is going to just change from day-to-day sending money, maybe across border, to, as you said, mortgages. How is it going to change? How is it going to shape up that mortgage? That is so exciting. So I cannot wait. And Brian, I'd love to get your perspective here too about this European legislation. We've heard some really exciting use cases from Anu. I mean, can I get some additional ones?
Yeah, certainly. Look, I think we have this situation here where we can't look at just PSD2 or PSR in isolation. We've kind of got a bit of a symphony of regulatory interventions, FIDA, even the instant payment regulation, and actually active ongoing EBA guidance coming in on even the SCA process only 3 weeks ago. We had an intervention by EBA confirming that the app-to-app and biometric capabilities are absolutely mandatory. So like we're not in a static situation. The good thing about what we have here is these are benefits that give the industry confidence to invest in the space. And we can see now, that the EU is 100% committed to developing this market, to supporting the players in it, to strengthening it. That's a fantastic situation. We should thank our lucky stars. I think in Europe, because not every region has it. We can come back to what other regions are doing well, but there's some really powerful interventions happening here. So look, I think it's just an exciting time. This isn't just something that has an effect in 2 to 3 years time. Already we're seeing people change their behaviors and place investments into the space on the back of what they're expecting in this area.
Absolutely incredible. And Nida, if I could come to you just to kind of wrap up this element of the question and just, in your view as well. I know we've already covered it from 2 other speakers, but how you see this as kind of enabling that next phase. Is it really that access that I've heard throughout this conversation that's going to be the key driver here? Yeah,
absolutely. Thank you, Douglas. And I agree with what's been said, right? I think the key aspect of this is really the access that PSD3 will bring, especially for those non-bank entities. So when you think about all of the other payment service providers, I think that was one of the game-changing aspects of PSD2 when it came in back in the UK as well. And suddenly that fueled quite a lot of innovative use cases that we're now seeing in the market in the UK. And we always talk about how the UK has now suddenly become ahead in terms of open banking. There's a lot that you can learn from the UK and its implementation of open banking as well. And I think moving that now across to how Europe's going to look at it with better access for those PSP providers, I think that's going to be really interesting. It does really encourage competition. It pushes all of us as players in the market to have better products. And it just, I think, makes it a better environment for our customers as well. So, whether we think about SME customers, consumer customers, everyone benefits from there being a more competitive environment. Initially, I think, Douglas, you had mentioned the point around there being less of a collaborative environment in the past. And I think now we can see with these fintech players as well, there's more of a collaborative environment, more banks trying to do better when it comes to integrating with fintechs and ultimately providing better products to customers.
Yeah, it definitely does seem to be a change in mindset, but ultimately starting to realize that the customer is always right, and we need to start catering towards that. And it's exciting to see the use cases that can come out of it. But one thing I think, and I'm almost ashamed to have to bring it up again, when we've all heard about it for far too long, is when PSD2 came out, obviously pre-Brexit. We're now in a very different ecosystem. And yeah, I hate to use the B word, but Brian, what are the differences between the approach taken by the UK and Europe as we move towards open finance?
Yeah, look, it's in some ways it's too early to tell. But I think what we are definitely seeing is some of the things that work in the UK are being adopted by Europe and vice versa. So the confirmation of payee scheme, which is very successful in the UK, is included in the instant payment regulation for Europe. It will be expanded with PSD3 to all credit transfers, not just instant ones. So that's exactly what you want to see. Of course, it's like the best ideas, porting across. I think there's a really interesting potential in PSD3 around merchant initiated payments and how they will be exempt potentially from SCA for the recurring piece, and that there will be 8-week refund rights similar to SEPA direct debit. It's not exactly kind of defined yet, but that seems to me like it might have the ingredients of a VRP for Europe. So we might be laying foundations that can be built upon in Europe, and perhaps who knows which one will then overtake the other, right?
Absolutely amazing. And Anu, can I also get your perspective here as well from EY? I'd love to get that kind of global outlook and that kind of different approaches between the UK and Europe.
Yeah, definitely Brian's point. It's really good to see confirmation of pay being adopted across SEPA Inst and through this directive as well. A couple of other things, the capital requirements that the directive itself has put in place, that there may be some divergence there on how the FCA tackles that, depending on the size of the organization, and also the liquidity requirements around that as well. The other thing to kind of bear in mind, one of the things that the directive tries to do is around SCA for these providers to use the same factor twice, whereas previously you had to, out of the 3 factors, when you do strong customer authentication, you had to use one of each twice, but now you can have the same factor used twice, which is slightly diverging from what the UK has implemented. And I think I spoke about this earlier around making reimbursements mandatory. That's again very good in terms of direction they're taking around consumer protection. Slight deviation again around kind of major incidents. I think they've now got to report on major incidents, all these PSPs, where the UK haven't made a kind of strong statement around that as yet. So those are kind of top deviations and what we can see in terms of similarities as well.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, I do love that kind of that balance between similarities and obviously differences, because that is when you really get the contrasts, and from there you can understand whether it's been a success or not. Now we've got, I usually reserve these to the end of the session, but some of them have been so perfectly timed to what we're talking about now. I'm going to bring in some audience questions now, and one of them is, Piers, if I could come to you with this. You know, we've all talked about PSD2 and it's almost been this pat on the back for the kind of European open banking movement. But, you know, can you call those world class? And you know, in your experience, have you seen any other regions in the world actually grapple with it in a better way?
Yeah, great questions coming in from the audience. Look, I think going back to the original comment, the UK has been or is seen as an open banking Mecca, and probably also as a really progressive financial services landscape to the wider globe, actually. If you look at parts of APAC, so particularly Singapore, the monetary authority in Singapore has really looked to what the UK and arguably the EU has done pre-Brexit together, but has looked to some of the progressions, the changes, the regulatory landscape that we have enabled that has allowed this innovation really to come to life. I think just looking forward to PSD3, you mentioned Brexit. I suspect that the British will use this as an opportunity for a really kind of healthy, competitive opportunity here. In some senses, we are less hindered by being sort of, you know, one country rather than 27 member states, and we do have the talent pool, the really kind of progressive digital first mindset, both from a consumer, end user perspective, as well as from the financial service providers within the country. And I suspect we will be looking very, very closely, or continue to look very, very closely at what is being implemented in the EU. And I suspect there will be a really, really healthy dose of competition, as I said, to see how the UK can remain at that progressive forefront of financial service experience for consumers, financial service inclusion and various other things like that.
Well, let's hope that the UK's lawmakers are listening to us right now. Now, with that in mind, we've also, this isn't a question, but we've had a brilliant point in terms of that global look from the audience as well. And that's just to look at the fact that over in the United States, we're going to see Dodd-Frank 1033 coming. That's really going to enable open finance for all Americans. So thank you very much for our commenters to bring that up, because it's so often such a European dialogue, like, oh, we're bringing this regulation, and in America, it's very kind of customer driven. It's exciting to see that we're starting to see that also come into play. Now, Anita, as well, with Alica Bank, I know that there's a lot of work here in the UK. So can you tell us about the approach that Alica Bank's taking when it comes to looking at this new regulation here in the UK and potentially even Europe?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess this is one of the this is a really good question, because when you think about all of the panelists here today, as well as our listeners, they probably represent all sorts of payment service providers, as well as other types of providers that are serving the industry as a whole. And so the approach does differ, depends on how we look to implement this. From an Alica Bank perspective, given we are a bank, we've got the access already today. We've implemented SCA, we've implemented all of the requirements from a PSD2 perspective, so we're fine. Obviously, a bit too early to say how this is going to impact the UK in terms of how we would expand. But one of the I guess the considerations that I would have for any organization that is looking to implement this and think about how this might impact them is to think about their expansion strategy. So if they are looking at expanding to anywhere in Europe or beyond, how is open banking being implemented within those jurisdictions? Especially if you think about Europe, and when we've talked about there being potentially easier access to the payment schemes, that then might change the approach that you might take as a bank looking to expand internationally. So you may not want to go for a full banking license. You may just want to go ahead as an EMI. And then, of course, there might be other additional safeguarding requirements that Anu had mentioned in the beginning, and liquidity requirements that you need to be aware of. But it will impact how you think about your expansion strategy. The product person in me will always say, think about your customers, the impact and the opportunities this could bring to your customers. So for Alica Bank, given we service the SME, the established SME segment in the UK, which we believe is very, very underserved by the incumbents at the moment, we think about essentially sharing of data. So from the data aspect, given this is beyond just open banking, this is now looking at open finance as the infrastructure. And if things like pensions, etc., may not be as applicable, things like integration with accountancy softwares, payroll integrations, ERP systems, that's really, really key, right? It really makes life easier for our customer base. And that's what we're looking to do as Alica as well. Then could there be an angle, and I know we don't want to mention the B word, but could there be an angle in the future beyond just PSD3 as well, where we think about a future where it could be, COP for all cross-border transactions, a COP being confirmation of pay, and account checking for all cross-border transactions, or even between just the UK and Europe. I think that would substantially help make life easier for our customers, would also make trade easier, and would just bring a lot of benefits to our customers as well in terms of fraud. And then finally wanted to touch on, I think we've mentioned before, the data sharing side and the security side of that. So the permission dashboard, really make it easier from an implementation perspective to have that in the hands of the customer, as opposed to, the banks owning it in the back end and the customer not knowing where the data is going and how they can essentially own that, take away the authorization when they want to take that authorization away. So really look at it both from the lens of how you would implement it internally, but then also how you could potentially benefit your customers from the implementation of PSD3.
Yeah, it's going to be a really big balancing act. I know you've brought up elements of fraud, for instance, there, and obviously that authentication process, and also the kind of trade implications that come with cross-border payments. And you can see how, as a retailer or a small business, that must be such a big headache. And it's fascinating to know that actually this is being designed to help those retailers, help those businesses streamline the payments process, also hopefully reduce fraud, even though if there's going to be a stronger customer authentication element, and it's going to be finding that balance of what sticks and what doesn't. Brian, could I also get your perspective on how organizations, because I feel like your organization's very well placed to answer this, what aspects should they be concerned about?
So in terms of, the key change here that I think is going to drive open banking adoption is first actually the instant payment regulation. We've been looking for this as an industry for quite a long time, and the SEPA zone didn't have that, so that's a huge step forward. I do think access to the actual central settlement systems for non-banks is also a great way to introduce more competition, and we've had that in the UK for a little while, and it's great to see that extending out into Europe. Look, I would say firms that are regulated need to be conscious of, the requirement to recertify under the new standard. So we had to do that before when we moved from PSD1 to PSD2. It's a bit of a burden, but not thankfully imminent. There's a little bit of time to prepare for it. But as Annie mentioned, there's a few areas where they're raising the bar, and players will need to kind of live up to the expectations of regulators, particularly if they're going to get involved in central bank settlement.
Yeah, it's almost interesting that it's kind of like another watershed moment, just in the fact that it's making other organizations have to reapply. So we have that watershed. We know the quality of the APIs are going to be good. And lastly, I know it's always a bad show to kind of bring three people onto the same question, but Piers, can I also get your perspective? Have you seen, for instance, at CurrencyCloud, how you can help these organizations, manage that, sending that money cross-border, and how's that going to change? What should these retailers be looking for?
Yeah, I think this all comes back to the very points, the essence of PSD2 and 3, which is around the end customer experience. And as we've seen the level of services and offerings be expanded out to end customers, whether they're consumers or SMBs or other, that level of consumer or customer demand also starts to increase. And as a provider to those, as a service provider to those end customers, a key challenge really is then thinking about how do we continue to retain all of those hard-won customers by offering them all of the additional services that they now start to expect almost out of the box with any institution that they might be contracting with, and with open finance that will only start to increase. And I think the burden on all of us, on lots of different financial institutions, is then to look at how do you continue to meet that customer demand and retain your hard-won customers. And I really think that in the era of kind of APIs acting as the piping around the global digital economy for more and more data, it is this era of collaboration, of partnership. As CurrencyCloud, we partner with best-in-class, transaction screening monitoring providers to enhance what we're doing internally, or with, beneficiary data validation providers. We don't try to build this all ourselves, because the API economy allows you to partner and collaborate in a far more efficient, streamlined way than ever before. And I really think that will be the secret sauce, more and more so, in the coming years with this. I think you called it a symphony of regulations, Brian. But with this symphony, it will need this enhanced level of collaboration, partnership, to find the best-in-class providers for whatever aspect of that set of financial services you're looking to offer out to your customers.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And Brian as well, thank you for, such a lovely phrase, but we need a conductor if we're going to have a symphony. And Anu, if I could come to you and ask, what's one thing that the EU regulators could do to kind of make sure the symphony stays on track with the development of Europe's open finance ecosystem? Probably putting the hardest question to you right at the end here, but yeah, I mean, what would be your one piece of advice?
I think it's a great question. Whenever I talk about innovation, I think one of the things I always say is there's an element of the regulators coming in early on when you're trying to build out an innovation in a region and putting the foundations in place, like consumer protection and consumer duty, but then stepping away for the innovators to kind of do the magic and grow those products and features and the innovation that they need in the market, and then coming back in when it's quite mature and building out that framework to be a stronger framework. So if you look at Dodd-Frank and what it's trying to achieve in the US, quite fragmented market with the federated approach they've got in the US already around payments. So it's attempting to achieve that kind of cohesive, data-driven platform that really sets a foundation for open finance. So I would imagine the same for you, along with UK. And for us to kind of collectively look at creating that profound kind of data platform where people can innovate on top, and think about things like, ChatGPT, technologies that can really use that kind of large language models that we can create with this capability and build on top some exciting products that we can offer as finance products.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, and it kind of speaks to just how much has changed since PSD2. You bring up generative AI, and I know a lot of people that were working on it were fully aware of its capabilities, but I think a lot of people in the industry weren't ready for how widespread that would be. And now that the consumers are used to that level of technology, we're now having to keep up with the consumer demand, which is so exciting. And Nida, I'd love to get your perspective as well, because one thing that the European Union and regulators seem to be very keen on, that kind of Annie was bringing up, was looking at protection. And I'd love to see your insight into like what they could do to enable vulnerable customers to either be educated more, and really, is this the time that we can help reduce fraud, for instance?
Yeah, good question. Actually relates to one of the audience questions as well. So if I can, I'll try to cover them all together. I think the question was around whether the European public really understands what all of this means, right? So as at first, I think I would say, PSD and PSD2 were great at pushing the banks to do better, and that allowed a lot of innovative services and better fraud protections to be released to the market, and consumers really benefited from that, right? I think the onus is, and all of us, we speak about it so much, we're kind of almost in our own echo chambers a bit. We all agree with each other, we get it, we know we need it, but we have a responsibility to also educate the wider public so that they understand, and vulnerable customers is one of them. So obviously United Kingdom's doing a bit more with consumer duty, etc., coming in, with other regulations coming in around APP fraud. And I know that PSD3 will, of course, take that forward as well, and they'll look at implementing some of that on their side. But I do think there could potentially be more that can be done on the education front. I don't think people will fully understand or grapple yet what benefit could come to them through this symphony of regulation, as Brian called it.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to then, after that, go to the man who came up with a piece of prose himself and see, yeah, what one thing do you think the EU regulators could do to help this development?
So, like the EU is actually pretty good at listening to the market. So there's a lot of engagement, So, we're members of the Open Finance Association. We really feel we're getting heard, and and I think it's so that's first of all really really impressive. The trick is to kind of figure out, okay, well, what do you actually want to kind of regulate, and what do you want to leave to the market? And you've seen some parts of the world where a greater proportion of the stack, let's say, was prescribed. So standards were more clear, maybe user experience guidelines were a bit more prescriptive, maybe not fully prescriptive, but at least the bar was set at a minimum. And that's allowed those countries usually to kind of get adoption a bit faster. Now you don't want regulation everywhere. You want to leave enough competitive space above that, but certainly you can see that the markets that have kind of moved faster were a bit clearer in what they want. And in fairness, actually, I think the split of PSD2 into a directive and a regulation is a very kind of clear indication that the EU has learned from the past. And doesn't want to have so much fragmentation across each country. So the regulation obviously applies universally, and you pick and choose the kind of elements where you want to have local discretion, but maybe not in the more technical logistical stuff, because then consumers don't understand it. So I think that's a positive sign, and if we can keep having those kind of feedback loops, then we'll be well served, I think.
Now, I mean, with that, if I could have, I guess, Piers, if I could come to you then, and we've heard some really impressive elements from the European Union, but we actually had a viewer chime in and say, does the EU bureaucracy actually get in the way of financial services innovation? I'm firing quite a feisty question towards you, especially after we've heard Brian say how elegant it can be, and how they've had a nuanced approach now. Do you think there's going to be an element where the UK can actually kind of keep up and maybe even go ahead?
Potentially. I think this comes back to the comment earlier, from a competitive perspective. I think, look, obviously the benefit of the 27 member states all being bound by at least a directive to start with allows for that change to be progressed across a very, very wide range and number of end customers in a huge number of areas, despite the fact that that they are all within the EU, within the EEA or the SEPA region. that I think when you look at the elapsed time, that can sometimes mean that certain changes may take longer, will take longer to actually be fully adopted by all of the different players and customers within all of those different regions. But there is obviously the benefit that cohesion actually does allow those changes to be brought to a huge number of end customers across a very, very large region.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think of how many financial interactions or payments, the volume has increased dramatically, especially, open banking payments, and it's going to be, just seeing that scale is so impressive. But we've kind of asked when, where, how, but one of the most important questions is, and we kind of had this when we all spoke together just before we jumped on, is why are we having a PSD3? And now this is quite a big question. So I'm unfortunately got to pick on someone, but Anu, I'd love to kind of get your perspective on why are we having a PSD3, and kind of like as Nida brought up, one of our viewers mentioned, are we doing enough to educate consumers about open finance, open banking? And if people haven't understood PSD2, why are we having a PSD3?
Yeah, I'm going to go back to kind of my reference earlier on kind of 3 tiers that we're trying to tackle here. We're trying to tackle the consumer, we're trying to tackle the payments community, and we're trying to tackle the EU market as a whole. So from a consumer's perspective, some of the concerns that came out of PSD2 is, are we doing enough around education? Do they understand what open banking PSD2 is? Do they understand the fraud, financial crime implications around that? Do they know when they sign up with a new PSP what they're taking on, basically? So I think there's a lot to tackle there around education, giving them comfort around how they're authenticated, authorized when they do choose to go with some of these PSPs. And then secondly, coming back to the PSPs, I think some of them struggled with PSD2 in terms of getting access to bank accounts, in terms of getting the right levels of authorization that they needed in the region. So I think what PSD3 tries to do is make it more transparent, make it a level playing field for everybody, and so open it up to wider competition as a result of that. And thirdly, a lot of fragmentation that we saw with PSD2 in the region, which resulted in, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of arbitration that happened, right? And lots of wasted kind of energy that went into each country kind of figuring out what PSD2 meant for them. So what PSD3 tries to do is really create that overarching framework that makes everyone kind of adhere to a set of technical standards, as well as sort of rules that everyone understands and adheres to at the end of the day.
Absolutely amazing. I love it when speakers bring things into 3 perfect tranches to just kind of comment on and understand. But Brian, with that in mind then, with that in mind, sorry, so with the scale of PSD3 and everything like that, and the fact that we're going to have organizations have to reapply like that, can you tell us what is that going to mean for the ecosystem? And sorry for chewing out such a long question, but if I could just put it down into a more succinct question, Brian, I'd love to get your perspective on what it's going to mean having to kind of re-authenticate. I know you mentioned that you've already had to do it with PSD2, but I mean, what's that going to mean for the industry as a wider issue? Is it going to be a positive thing?
Yeah, so I suppose I'd say to kind of zoom out a little bit. These interventions by regulators, the politicians, etc., are all designed to kind of help the industry achieve its potential, right? So they're trying to create a more competitive, more innovative payment landscape in Europe. They've given us instant payments across the entire market. They are allowing payment service providers access to settlement rails so that there's no problem in terms of the competitive kind of dynamic between PSPs and banks who are trying to challenge each other and then having dependency on each other. We've got additional scope in terms of FIDA around kind of broadening this out to insurance, pensions, etc. These are all fantastic interventions. So if we have to kind of go through a reauthorization on PSD3, I think the industry will be fine with that, because if you're going to get more access, you do need to have more responsibility in the players who are accessing it. So I think overall very, very positive. It's probably, moving a little bit more slowly than some players would like, but that is Europe, unfortunately. And there's a lot of players to get involved. There's a lot of complexity. But we're doing big things here. Like if you look at the US, while they have had some interventions with the Biden order and a few other things, there's no talk about a real kind of the depth of payment institution or EMI status that we have here. Like it's a really kind of disjointed market in some ways. So I do think that at least in a comparably developed economy, Europe's doing pretty well. Okay, and India or Brazil might be able to do things faster, but but in our context, I think it's positive.
Absolutely amazing. And we have talked about throughout this conversation the breadth of the scope that this is going to have across the financial services sectors. But if we can bring it back to payments, and Piers, if I can end on you before we hear some brilliant words from Helen, we're going to see the merging of e-money and payment institutions into one kind of license. So one question we got from the audience was, what will PSD3 mean for the payment sector, and what are the opportunities going to come out from that?
So I think sometimes the way I look at this is that we talk about a lot of acronyms, but they are internal within the industry. And we have to come back to, what is the end customer actually wanting to do? They want to pay a seller to buy some goods. They might be a small business who just wants to be paid by a client in a different country because that's what the global digital economy has enabled. I think that the key premise of PSD3 and all of the other acronyms, the really important acronyms we've talked about, are incredibly important from within the sector. But we do have to step back and say, actually, what is the end customer trying to do? How do we enable that? How do we talk to the end customer? Going back to one of the previous audience questions, how do we talk to the end customer in terms that they understand if they don't work and kind of live and breathe the types of acronyms that we've just talked about? And I suspect that the most impactful providers, service providers, who will emerge in the kind of the PSD3 next era, let's call it, will be the ones that actually manage to translate this back into normal human speak for many different types of end customers in all sorts of different industries in many different countries, who just have got a fairly simple job to get done, regardless of that whether they're an individual or a business.
Yeah, it's not an easy thing to solve. I'm banned from talking about open banking at the pub, so I know the challenges involved with it. But guys, I just want to say a massive thank you for all your insights. We really are shaping the future of the industry here, and so I just want to say a massive thank you. And I'm going to pass things back to Helen. So thank you.
Doug, what a panel. Thank you very, very much. It's my absolute pleasure to wrap up. And I think Piers said it all at the end, didn't he? He really did. It's what does it mean for the customer? So I would just like to thank everybody. Doug, it was absolutely superbly hosted. Thank you very, very much. And a huge to CurrencyCloud, who have helped put this together and sponsored this particular campfire. And a big thank you to all of our panel. That's Piers, Anu, Brian, and Nida. Because what you've helped everybody is have a really, really solid foundation to learn. And what we see from our audience figures and what we see from the traffic to our website is that we now have this knowledge resource center that people come to be educated and to be informed. And I think you've all done an excellent job in the inspired part as well. So I just want to say a very heartfelt thank you, because what I can tell you now with almost certainty that our content has a very long tail to it. And I think this is one of those bedrock pieces of content that people will go back to. And I certainly will be re-listening to it on my turbo trainers, which is when I sort of catch up with everything at the weekend. Okay, so my last thank you is to the OBE team, who work incredibly hard behind the scenes with everybody to make this happen. And last of all, thank you to our audience, which now tune in from over 40 countries around the world. So thank you to them for making this possible. Take care and stay safe. Thank you all. Bye-bye.